Hey everyone, welcome back to our series on choosing components. In this video, we'll cover everything you need to know to choose the right motherboard for your build. Among other topics, we'll discuss the CPU socket, chipsets, and form factor. In each video of this series, we're also going to choose a component to go in our $1,000 gaming PC build. So at the end of this video, we'll take you through our thought process in choosing a motherboard for our build. With that being said, let's start off with the basics and discuss motherboard form factors. Motherboard form factor refers to the standardized sizes that are available for motherboards. There are 4 common motherboard form factors that you should be aware of if you're building a gaming PC. They are standard ATX, which is the standard size for motherboards, micro ATX, which is a bit smaller than standard ATX, mini ATX, which is smaller still, and extended ATX, which is slightly larger than standard ATX. Motherboard form factors will play a small role in determining what case you can use for your build, but as most cases that can hold standard ATX motherboards can also hold micro ATX and mini ATX motherboards as well, motherboard form factor as a compatibility issue really only comes up for those who are looking to build a small form factor system or for those who want to use a larger extended ATX motherboard. We'll discuss that a bit more in our guide on how to choose a PC case. Now, there are some general performance and feature differences between the different sizes of motherboards that you should be aware of. While a motherboard's chipset plays the biggest role in the kind of power design, features, and connectivity options a motherboard has, the size of a motherboard is loosely correlated to functionality as well. The more available space on a motherboard, the more features and connectivity options manufacturers can add to it. As an example, motherboard form factor can determine the maximum amount of memory you can use in your system. Standard ATX and extended ATX motherboards come with 4 DIMM slots to hold 4 sticks of memory. Mini ATX motherboards only come with 2 DIMM slots, and micro ATX motherboards can either come with 2 or 4 DIMM slots. Standard ATX and eATX motherboards also come with more PCIe lanes and typically come with more USB ports and headers and more M.2 ports. As a general rule of thumb, if you have a moderate budget of $1,000 or more, you should probably opt for a standard ATX motherboard unless you're specifically looking to build a small form factor system. If you have a lower budget, around $800 or less or so, you may want to consider a micro ATX motherboard to save some money. And if you do want to build a small form factor system, your best bet will be to get a micro ATX or mini ATX motherboard. Now that you have a good idea of the differences between the different motherboard form factors, let's talk about the CPU socket. The CPU socket is a hard compatibility issue, which means that you cannot pair a CPU with a motherboard that doesn't have the socket specifically designed to hold that CPU. As an example, let's do a quick search on Amazon to see if the first CPU and first motherboard that come up are compatible with each other. The first non-sponsored result when I search CPU on Amazon is AMD's Ryzen 7 5700G. The first non-sponsored result when I search motherboard on Amazon is Asus's TUF Gaming Z790 Plus. If you watched or read our guide on how to choose a CPU, then you probably know that these two are not compatible with each other. The Ryzen 7 5700G is an AMD processor, and the Asus TUF Gaming Z790 Plus is an Intel chipset motherboard. But how can you tell if a motherboard has the right socket for the CPU you're looking at? If you're not familiar with CPU sockets already, the best way to do so is to simply search Google for the CPU you are considering and go to the manufacturer's page, Intel or AMD, for that model CPU. Let's do that with the AMD Ryzen 7 5700G right now. After searching for Ryzen 7 5700G in Google, I've come to the 5700G's product page on AMD's website. From there, I want to search through the specs on the page and locate the processor socket. Under General Specifications, I can see the 5700G utilizes the AM4 socket. Easy enough. However, socket compatibility is not the only thing you need to consider. There's also soft compatibility issues when dealing with CPU chipsets. But before we talk about chipsets, we need to cover CPU generations. We touched a bit on this in our CPU video, but Intel and AMD release new generations of processors once every 1 to 2 years. Sometimes the processor sockets get upgraded with the launch of a new generation of processors, and sometimes they don't. That means that Intel or AMD could, and usually do, release multiple generations of CPUs that will all work on the same socket. For instance, the Ryzen 7 5700G mentioned earlier is a Ryzen 5000 series CPU that works on the AM4 socket. However, the Ryzen 1000 series, Ryzen 2000 series, and the Ryzen 3000 series CPUs all work on the AM4 socket as well. But AMD released their new AM5 socket when they launched their 7000 series CPUs. AMD's older Ryzen CPUs will not work in this new socket, and their new CPUs will not work in the older AM4 socket. The same thing happens with Intel CPUs, although Intel rarely goes more than a few generations before they introduce a new CPU socket. A CPU's generation is important to understand. In some cases, it can help you identify CPU and motherboard compatibility. But there's another important feature you'll need to check in order to ensure a motherboard is the right option for the CPU you have chosen. With each new CPU generation, we typically get new motherboard chipsets, and motherboard chipsets are incredibly important when considering what motherboard you should pair with your CPU. A motherboard chipset directs communication between your CPU and the other important components in your system. Chipsets play a big role in determining what kind of components you can use in your system, and chipsets can create soft compatibility issues that you need to be aware of. Generally, with each new CPU generation or architecture, a few new chipsets are released. Typically, you get a high-end chipset, a mid-range chipset, or in Intel's case, two mid-range chipsets, and a budget-oriented chipset. Chipsets can determine which CPUs you can use, whether or not you can overclock, the maximum amount of memory you can use, which DDR generation on your memory you can utilize, which generation PCIe you can utilize for your GPU and NVMe SSDs, how many SATA and USB ports you have access to, and which generation of USB technology you can use. They determine a bit more than that as well, but those are the main features you should be aware of. Modern chipsets are listed with 4-digit codes like Z790. This is an Intel chipset where Z equals the tier of the chipset, Z being the highest, 7 equals the series of the chipset, 9 equals the features on the chipset, the higher the number, the more features, and 0 equals a filler number that doesn't really mean anything. It's important to note that the second number, in this instance 9, isn't always instructive. For instance, all Z-tier chipsets will have a second number of 9. There is no Z770 chipset. However, Intel's H chipsets do offer different feature options. There's the H670 and the H610 chipsets, where the H670 chipset offers more features than the H610 chipset. But this is one of the only cases where the second digit offers us more information about the chipset. AMD's chipset naming works similarly, but unlike Intel, there are no instances where the second number gives us any additional information. Take, for example, the following AMD chipset. The X670 chipset, where X equals the tier of the chipset, X being the highest, 6 equals the series of chipset, 7 equals a filler number that means nothing, the 0 also equals a filler number that also means nothing. Before we list chipsets you'll likely use if you're building a PC right now, let's first come up with 3 general chipset tiers and what they typically offer. High-end chipsets will offer better VRMs to run more power-hungry CPUs, support for overclocking, support to overclock and run faster memory, and more connectivity options like PCIe, USB, SATA, etc. Mid-range chipsets will offer decent VRMs to run mid-range or high-end CPUs, allow for overclocking for AMD CPUs, not for Intel CPUs. They offer decent connectivity options, PCIe, USB, SATA, etc. Budget chipset options have weaker VRMs and are only suited for power-efficient CPUs, don't allow overclocking, have capped memory speeds, and have less connectivity options. Here's a list of Intel and AMD's most popular chipsets right now for both the current and previous generations. If you're building a PC in the near future, you will likely use one of these chipsets. For Intel's 13th generation processors, which use the LGA 1700 socket, there is the Z790 chipset, which is a higher-end chipset that allows CPU overclocking, the H770 chipset, which is a mid-range chipset that does not allow overclocking, and the B760 chipset, which is also a mid-range chipset that doesn't allow overclocking. Also note that Intel's 14th generation CPUs have been released, but no new chipsets have been introduced as of Q4 of 2023. H710 chipsets were also never released for 13th generation CPUs. For Intel's 12th generation processors, which use the LGA 1700 socket, there is the Z690 chipset, which is a higher-end chipset that allows CPU overclocking, the H670 chipset, which is a mid-range chipset that does not allow CPU overclocking, the B660 chipset, which is another mid-range chipset that doesn't allow overclocking, and the H610 chipset, which is a budget chipset that doesn't allow overclocking. For AMD's new Ryzen 7000 series processors, which use the AM5 socket, there is the X670 chipset, which is a higher-end chipset that allows CPU overclocking, the B650 chipset, which is a mid-range chipset that allows CPU overclocking, and the A620 chipset, which is a budget chipset that doesn't allow overclocking. For AMD's Ryzen 5000 series processors, which use the AM4 socket, there is the X570 chipset, which is a higher-end chipset that allows overclocking, the B550 chipset, which is a mid-range chipset that allows overclocking, and the A520 chipset, which is a budget chipset that doesn't allow overclocking as well. Now, certain processors are going to be better utilized by certain chipsets. Here are some generalizations to help you out. Newer CPUs will generally benefit using newer chipsets. Older generation CPUs may benefit using new chipsets. Higher-end CPUs will benefit using higher-end chipsets and may even require them. Higher-end chipsets would be a waste of money for lower-end CPUs. Some motherboards are better suited for overclocking. Some motherboards don't allow overclocking at all. So before you can pick the right chipset for your motherboard, you first need to have a good idea of what kind of performance and features a CPU will offer. For instance, let's say you've decided to get an Intel Core i7-13700K CPU, and now you're looking for the right motherboard to pair it with. You already know how to find the right socket. You've gone to Intel's website and determined that the i7-13700K is using the LGA 1700 socket, and therefore you know you need an LGA 1700 motherboard. Now you've gone to an online retailer to search for LGA 1700 motherboards, but there are a ton of options. Which one is the right one for you? Intel typically releases 4 different chipsets for each CPU generation. However, as there are usually a few different generations of CPUs available for a given CPU socket, that means if you search for LGA 1700 motherboard at an online retailer, you could potentially see as many as 12 different chipset options. And that's not to mention that each motherboard manufacturer, Asus, MSI, Gigabyte, ASRock, etc., could have multiple options for each of those 12 chipsets, so you could potentially be seeing well over 50 different motherboard options. In fact, if you go to Newegg and search for LGA 1700 motherboard, you get 6 pages of motherboard results. There are 18 pages of results total, but a lot of the listings are combo deals or refurbished or open box products. But with 36 results per page, that's over 200 different LGA 1700 motherboard options to choose from. Perhaps there is some overlap in those listings, but either way, it's a ton of motherboards, and if you're just going off of the CPU socket to find a compatible motherboard, you're probably not going to make the right choice. Because while all of those motherboards will physically hold the i7-13700K as designated by the socket, some of them may not utilize the 13700K to its full potential, and some may not work with it at all. So how do you know which one is right for you? Using the process of elimination, we can narrow down our search to make finding the right motherboard easier. From our video on how to choose a CPU, we know that the Intel Core i7-13700K is a higher-end CPU as designated by the i7, a newer generation as designated by the 13 for 13th generation, and that the K designation means it can be overclocked. And we already know it's an LGA 1700 CPU because we checked Intel's website. From the i7-13700K's product page, we can also see that it has a processor base power, that's Intel's new term for TDP, of 125 watts and a maximum turbo power of 253 watts, which likely means that the CPU will require a decent amount of power to operate. So with all of that information and everything we've learned so far, can we narrow down to an appropriate chipset? Yes, absolutely. Given this information, we need a higher-end motherboard that can support Intel's 13th generation CPUs that will allow for overclocking. With that being said, there's 2 chipsets that will work for the 13700K, the Z790 and Z690 chipsets. Of the two, it would be better to opt for the newer Z790 chipset. Your motherboard also plays a big role in determining what kind of RAM you can use in your build. As mentioned above, your motherboard will determine how many DIMM slots you can use, which in turn will determine how much total RAM you can install. Your motherboard chipset will also determine what DDR generation of memory you can use. Some motherboard chipsets like Intel's Z790 can support either DDR4 or DDR5 memory, depending on the board. But AMD's new Ryzen 7000 series processors and the chipsets that accommodate them only work with DDR5 memory. Your motherboard chipset will also determine whether or not you can overclock your memory and the maximum speeds you can push your memory to. Some budget chipsets like Intel's H610 chipset cap memory speeds at 3200 MHz. We'll talk more about memory in our video on how to choose RAM, but just know that the motherboard you choose will determine the kind of RAM you can use, and it will play a role in the performance you can get out of it. We mentioned VRMs briefly earlier, but it would be a good idea to give you a basic rundown of what they are and why they're important, especially since when we chose our motherboard for our build, it was one of the determining factors. VRM stands for Voltage Regulator Module and is the component on a motherboard that is responsible for delivering the correct voltage to your CPU. The quality of a motherboard's VRM is going to play a big role in determining what CPUs it can handle, as well as how high of overclocks you can hit. Lower-end VRMs are one of the reasons why high-end CPUs should not be used in budget-oriented motherboards. The weaker VRMs found on budget boards will not be able to meet the full power demands of the higher-end CPU. So how can you tell the quality of VRM that a motherboard comes with? Unfortunately, there is no one specification you can check that can provide you with the answer to that question. You could use the number of power phases a motherboard comes with as a basic indicator of VRM quality. Motherboard manufacturers usually include this information. High-end motherboards can come with 20+ power phase designs, while budget-oriented boards can come with 6 phases or less. However, this isn't the perfect way to determine VRM quality because more power phases doesn't automatically mean a quality VRM. Furthermore, mid-range and budget-oriented CPUs won't require VRMs with more power phases. A good 6 or 8 phase motherboard may be all you really need. The best way to check VRM quality is to read or watch reviews on the motherboard you are considering by reviewers like BuildZoid, that's actually hardcore overclocking on YouTube, Gamers Nexus, and Hardware Unboxed. Reddit user Relevant Pet Bug has also put together a great resource you can use to help you out. It's an extensive spreadsheet that sorts a lot of different motherboard options into tiers, and it includes VRM quality in its rankings. The list hasn't been updated for over a year now though, so it only lists AM4 chipset motherboards and 12th generation Intel chipsets. It's a good list to check if you are building with an older generation platform though, as we will be doing with our $1,000 build. If you want to check that spreadsheet out, we've linked to it in the description below. So if we could sum up how you should approach checking VRM quality when you go to buy a motherboard, it would be to check the power phase design and watch or read any detailed reviews of the motherboard you are considering. As a general rule of thumb for gaming-oriented builds, if you have a larger budget, around $1,000 or more, we recommend spending 8 to 12% of your budget on your motherboard. For lower budgets, you're going to have to spend more, around 10 to 15% of your budget, because there's a minimum amount that is required to get an adequate motherboard, and the lower your budget is, the higher the percentage of your budget the motherboard will become. Now that we've covered most of the main factors you need to know before you choose a motherboard, let's now go ahead and pick a motherboard for our $1,000 gaming PC build. We've already decided that we're going to use the $150 Ryzen 5 5600X because we believe it will allow us to maximize the amount we can spend on our graphics card without having to sacrifice too much performance. We also like the fact that we can get a little more performance out of it if we overclock it. So with that information, which motherboard chipset should we be looking for? To help us narrow down chipset options, let's identify some important information about the Ryzen 5 5600X. From what we learned in our video on how to choose a CPU, we know that the Ryzen 5 5600X is a mid-range processor. We also know we can find its socket information and TDP from AMD's product page. It is compatible with the AM4 socket and has a default TDP of 65 watts. So we definitely need an AM4 motherboard. But this one is a bit tricky because AMD allows for overclocking on more than one of their AM4 chipsets. We could use the higher-end X570 chipset. It will provide us with more than enough power to run the Ryzen 5 5600X, and it will allow us to overclock it as well. Remember though, while $1,000 is a decent sized budget, we are trying to save as much money possible for our GPU, so price is going to be very important. If we search for X570 motherboard on Amazon, we can see that at minimum, we'll need to pay $200 for an X570 motherboard. That means we'll be designating over a third of our budget to our CPU and motherboard combination. This will almost assuredly mean that we won't be able to spend as much on our graphics card, which is going to limit how much gaming performance we can get. In our opinion, while an X570 motherboard is technically compatible with the Ryzen 5 5600X, when you consider our total budget, it probably isn't the best option. What about the B550 and A520 chipsets? Both options would technically work for the 5600X. For pricing, a B550 chipset motherboard can be had for a minimum of $80 to $90, whereas an A520 chipset motherboard can be had for about $70. A B550 chipset board will allow you to hit mild overclocks on the 5600X, offers PCIe 4.0 support for your graphics card and SSD, and comes with a bit more connectivity options. An A520 chipset board will not allow you to overclock, only offers PCIe 3.0 support for your graphics card and SSD, and comes with less connectivity options. We want to have the option to overclock, so the real question we need to ask is, can we fit the $10 to $20 extra that the B550 motherboard costs into our budget? In our opinion, it should fit in just fine without forcing us to sacrifice in other areas of our build. So we think the B550 chipset is the perfect option given our CPU choice and total budget. Now let's find a B550 motherboard. If possible, we'd like to spend less than $100, and we'd also like to get a standard ATX motherboard. It won't be difficult to find a micro ATX B550 motherboard for under $100, but a standard ATX might be a bit trickier. At the time we went to purchase parts on Amazon, there were two motherboards that fit our criteria. The MSI B550 gaming motherboard for $99.99 and ASRock's B550 Phantom Gaming 4 for $89.98. At first glance, we'd lean towards spending a little extra to get the MSI board, as in our opinion, its all-black design is more aesthetically pleasing. However, a quick dig into the specs shows that the MSI board only comes with support for PCIe 3.0, whereas the ASRock offers support for PCIe 4.0. We aren't terribly concerned about the real-world performance differences between PCIe 3.0 and 4.0 in regards to our graphics card or SSD, because most benchmarks show that the difference is minimal. However, the fact that the ASRock board offers the newer generation technology and costs $10 less swings us towards the ASRock board. Furthermore, the ASRock board features a better 8-phase VRM than the MSI motherboard, which features 6 phases, and that will likely make the ASRock board a better option for overclocking. Not to mention, the ASRock motherboard is rated well on Reddit user Relevant Pet Bugs tier list, which we mentioned earlier. So while we like the all-black design of the MSI motherboard, in terms of performance and features, the ASRock board will be better, and it's cheaper. So we'll choose it for our $1,000 gaming PC build. With an AMD Ryzen 5 5600X, the Thermalright Burst Assassin cooler, and an ASRock B550 motherboard, we're now up to about $264 total spent. That leaves us with around $750 to spend on our graphics card, memory, an SSD, a case, and a power supply. Alright, that concludes our guide to choosing a motherboard. If we missed anything, or if you're having trouble picking a motherboard for your build, leave us a comment below. In the next video, we'll talk about choosing the most important component when it comes to gaming performance, your graphics card. We'll see you there.